They say the dead take their secrets to the grave, but my brother hid his inside a closed server meant only for me. 3 hours after I watched his casket lowered into the cold Seattle ground, my husband handed me divorce papers and left for my brother's widow. He walked away believing he had stolen a massive tech empire. He had no idea he was stepping into a financial guillotine meticulously designed just for him. Hello to the wonderful audience of Violet Revenge stories. YouTube has disabled our monetization feature, leaving us without an operating budget. So if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our staff for their living expenses and continue creating for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the video description and comments. My name is Lydia, and this is the story of how my world shattered and how I rebuilt it from the sharpest pieces. The freezing rain of Seattle felt like shattered glass against my skin as we stood around the open earth of the cemetery. It was a bleak, unforgiving afternoon, perfectly mirroring the hollow cavern that had formed in my chest over the past few days. We were burying Thomas, my older brother, my protector, and the brilliant mind behind Vanguard Horizon, a technology empire that had fundamentally reshaped the digital industry. Hundreds of his employees lined the winding cemetery pathways, holding massive black umbrellas that formed a dark, undulating river of mourning across the manicured green lawns. They wept genuine tears for a leader who had been both fiercely demanding and profoundly generous. I stood rigidly at the very front row, ignoring the cold as the icy drops soaked entirely through my dark wool coat, chilling me to the core. Beside me stood Marcus, the man I had called my husband for 7 long years. His arm rested loosely around my waist, a carefully calculated, performative gesture meant purely for the grieving crowd and the clicking cameras of the local business press. But I could feel the rigid tension in his muscles, the utterly distracted nature of his physical presence. His gaze was not on the polished mahogany casket sinking into the mud, nor was it fixed respectfully on the ground. His eyes were locked with a starving, predatory intensity on Elena, Thomas's widow. She stood on the exact opposite side of the open grave, draped in an outrageously expensive designer black silk dress, performing a theatrical display of agony. She sobbed delicately, repeatedly pressing a white lace handkerchief to her perfectly dry eyes, trembling just enough to draw sympathy from the board members standing behind her. But I saw the sharp, calculating, almost greedy glances she shot back at Marcus whenever the umbrellas shifted and no one else was looking. There was a sickening, palpable electricity between them, a silent, vibrating conversation humming with anticipation right over my brother's fresh grave. I knew then the betrayal was not a sudden, shocking suspicion, but a confirmed, heavy reality settling over me like the cold mud below. The luxury town car ride back to our house was suffocating in its absolute silence. The moment the heavy oak front door of our estate clicked shut behind us, locking out the stormy world, the entire illusion evaporated. The somber, performative mourning Marcus had worn at the cemetery vanished instantly, replaced by an unsettling, manic, and almost joyful energy. He did not even bother to take off his damp dress coat. Instead, he walked straight to his leather briefcase, aggressively unbuckled it, pulled out a thick-bound stack of legal documents, and threw them violently onto the pristine marble kitchen island. The heavy thud echoed sharply through the painfully quiet house. I looked down at the bold, terrifying letters printed across the top page. Divorce papers, without a single ounce of hesitation or a shred of human decency. Marcus declared he was leaving me immediately, and he proudly announced he was moving directly into Thomas's massive lakeside estate with Elena tonight. I slowly lifted my head, staring away from the pages and looking directly into his face. There was absolutely no guilt in his dark eyes, only the swollen, blinding arrogance of a man who firmly believed he had just effortlessly conquered the world. "You should not look so surprised, Lydia," he spat, his voice dripping with venom and pure condescension. "You have always been far too weak, far too soft to truly understand ambition. You completely lack the spine to stand beside a man who is destined to build and rule an empire. You would only drag me down with your pathetic sentimentality and your constant need for emotional validation. Elena understands raw power. She understands exactly what it takes to seize control and ruthlessly expand Vanguard Horizon into the future. She is a woman of my exact caliber. You are just collateral damage in a much larger, much more important game. He paced the hardwood kitchen floor, practically vibrating with the physical thrill of his own perceived glorious victory. He actually had the audacity to grin at me. He expected tears. He expected me to fall to my knees, to desperately beg him to stay, to scream at the top of my lungs, to give him the twisted, sadistic satisfaction of watching me break completely into pieces. Instead, the freezing coldness of the Seattle rain seemed to seep deeply into my very bones, instantly freezing every single emotion, leaving behind only a terrifying, crystallized clarity of mind. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice a fraction of a decibel. I simply reached into my black leather purse, calmly pulled out my favorite silver fountain pen, and uncapped it with a soft, deliberate click. I leaned silently over the cold marble island and signed my full name on every single required line with a perfectly steady, unbroken hand. The harsh scratch of the metal pen nib on the thick paper was the only sound echoing in the massive room. When I finished the final page, I methodically stacked the papers and pushed them back across the counter toward his chest. Marcus abruptly stopped pacing. His triumphant, cruel smile faltered, quickly replaced by a flash of deep confusion and sudden irritation. He had wanted a screaming war, a final, dramatic assertion of his dominance over me. My absolute, unbreakable silence entirely robbed him of his grand victory. Immensely frustrated by my total lack of expected emotional collapse, he angrily snatched the signed papers, aggressively grabbed the large suitcase he had apparently packed in secret days ago, and stormed out the front door without looking back. The heavy door slammed violently shut, rattling the window panes. The large house was finally, blissfully empty. I stood completely alone in the darkening kitchen for exactly 3 minutes, simply breathing the stale air and listening to the rain beating against the glass. Then, the heavy silence was shattered by the sharp, metallic ping of my personal cell phone. I pulled it from my pocket. It was not a regular text message or an email. It was a highly encrypted notification routing directly through a secure, offline private server network that Thomas had built exclusively for the two of us many years ago. My heart completely stopped in my chest. Thomas was dead. I had just physically watched them bury him beneath the earth. With trembling, cold fingers, I authenticated my identity and opened the encrypted application. It was a digitally scheduled message, ingeniously programmed by my brilliant brother to send upon the exact, automated confirmation of his official death certificate hitting the state registry database. The screen illuminated the dark, lonely room with a harsh, glaring white light. There was no final, emotional farewell, no sentimental poetry about the afterlife, and no comforting words of grief. It contained only one single, absolute directive burning on the screen. Meet lawyer Arthur Vance in downtown Seattle at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, for exactly 14 days. The high society of Seattle was treated to a sickening display of shameless arrogance. Marcus and Elena paraded their new, grotesque union across the city as if they had just won a grand prize rather than having danced on a fresh grave. They were suddenly entirely inseparable, photographed by local society blogs, dining at the most exclusive waterfront restaurants and attending elite, closed-door galas. They drank $1,000 bottles of vintage champagne while the ink on my divorce papers and Thomas's death certificate was barely dry. They operated under the delusional assumption that my silence meant I was defeated. Crushed under the weight of their combined betrayal, they mistook my total absence from the social scene for absolute surrender, genuinely believing I was hiding in my house weeping over my shattered life. Their audacity quickly metastasized from pathetic social climbing to a full-scale corporate invasion, without waiting for the legal reading of the will or any formal board approval. Marcus confidently marched into the towering glass headquarters of Vanguard Horizon. He bypassed the security desks, swaggered directly into the executive suite, and physically claimed Thomas's custom leather chair behind the massive oak desk. He immediately began summoning senior vice presidents and chief operating officers, loudly barking out uneducated directives and demanding sweeping operational shifts. He strutted through the pristine hallways, puffing out his chest, referring to the company's multi-million-dollar assets and hundreds of employees as his own personal treasury. Not to be outdone in the realm of sheer entitlement, Elena quickly established herself as the self-appointed queen of the tech empire. She treated the corporate headquarters like her own private dollhouse. She began sending demanding, threatening emails to the Human Resources Department, insisting on completely restructuring the executive administrative staff simply because she did not like the color palette of their uniforms or the tone of their voices. She fired 2 veteran project managers on a Tuesday afternoon just because they dared to question her authority to halt a major software deployment. She roamed the executive floors dripping in diamonds, bought with company money, loudly planning expensive renovations to the corporate boardroom to better reflect her so-called sophisticated aesthetic. They were moving at breakneck speed, drunk on the intoxicating illusion of absolute power, completely blinded by their own towering greed. While they loudly celebrated their stolen kingdom, I became a ghost. I maintained absolute, impenetrable silence. I completely deactivated all of my social media accounts. I did not post a single cryptic quote, nor did I upload any tearful videos begging for public sympathy. I flatly ignored the frantic, probing phone calls from my former in-laws and the invasive text messages from gossiping mutual acquaintances. I refused to give anyone a single fractured piece of my grief to consume for their own entertainment. Instead, I vanished from the public eye and slipped into the shadows, quietly navigating the damp, gray morning streets of the city. My only destination was an unassuming, heavily guarded brick building located on the edge of the financial district. Inside sat the sprawling, wood-paneled office of Arthur Vance, my brother's fiercely loyal and incredibly ruthless corporate attorney. Arthur was a man who spoke in measured tones and sharp facts, and over the course of several secret, exhaustive meetings spanning those 2 weeks, he finally pulled back the heavy curtain on Thomas's ultimate masterpiece. Sitting across from his wide desk, staring at stacks of heavily redacted financial ledgers and offshore banking records, I learned the terrifying truth about my brother's final months. Arthur looked me dead in the eye and revealed that Thomas had not been blind to the betrayal unfolding under his own roof. In fact, he had discovered Marcus and Elena's vile affair nearly 8 months before his illness finally took his life. But the sickening infidelity was merely the surface of their betrayal. Thomas had uncovered a meticulously hidden trail of shell companies and falsified vendor invoices. Marcus and Elena had been secretly siphoning millions of dollars out of Vanguard Horizon's offshore research and development funds. They were systematically bleeding the company dry to fund their lavish, secret lifestyle and prepare for a grand hostile takeover upon his eventual passing. Why did he not just call the federal authorities? I asked, my voice barely a whisper as the sheer magnitude of their theft washed over me. He could have had them both arrested and thrown into a federal prison on massive embezzlement charges in a matter of hours. He had all the proof right here. Arthur leaned back in his heavy leather chair, a chilling, calculating smile touching the corners of his mouth. Because your brother believed that a simple prison sentence was far too merciful for what they did to you, and what they tried to do to his life's work, Arthur explained, his voice low and dangerous. Thomas understood that men like Marcus and women like Elena are driven solely by their insatiable hunger for status, recognition, and unearned wealth. Putting them behind bars immediately would only make them victims or martyrs in their own twisted minds. He wanted to give them exactly what they lusted after. He wanted to hand them the heavy crown they craved, but only after coating the inside of it with a slow-acting, inescapable financial poison. Arthur slid a thick black binder across the polished mahogany desk toward me. It contained the intricate blueprints of a trap so brilliantly complex and devastating that it completely took my breath away. Thomas had spent the final agonizing months of his life not resting, but quietly constructing a massive, inescapable financial black hole. He had weaponized the very company they were desperately trying to steal. He chose not to stop them from taking the public face of Vanguard Horizon. Instead, he carefully arranged the invisible pieces on the board to ensure that the precise moment they finally grabbed the prize, the entire empire would detonate in their greedy hands. He was preparing to instantly vaporize their stolen wealth and bury them under an avalanche of catastrophic federal debt. They were currently dancing wildly on a stage built entirely out of dynamite, and my brother had just handed me the only match. The heavy oak doors of Arthur Vance's conference room clicked shut, sealing us inside a space that felt less like a legal office and more like a high-stakes execution chamber. The massive mahogany table stretched out long and polished, reflecting the cold gray light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the towering Seattle skyline. I sat perfectly still at the far end, my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing a simple, understated navy blue suit. The air in the room was incredibly thick, practically suffocating with the unspoken, vibrating tension that hung heavily between the opposing sides of the long table. The door swung open a few minutes later, and Marcus and Elena made their grand, highly anticipated entrance. They did not simply walk. They glided into the room as if they were arriving at an exclusive red carpet gala, rather than the solemn reading of a dead man's will. Elena wore a stunning, form-fitting crimson dress that screamed of newfound wealth and absolute, shameless defiance. It was a bold, deliberate departure from the theatrical mourning black she had worn at the cemetery just weeks prior. Heavy diamond earrings sparkled aggressively under the recessed lighting, catching the eye with every slight movement of her head. Marcus walked closely beside her, clad in a flawlessly custom-tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than most people earned in 6 months of hard labor. He practically radiated an aura of untouchable, blinding confidence. They confidently took their seats directly across from me, their shoulders touching, presenting a united, impenetrable front of sheer arrogance. Marcus leaned back in his expensive leather chair, a sickeningly smug smile playing on the corners of his lips. He looked at me, not with anger or malice, but with a deep, humiliating sense of pity. In his warped mind, I was already a ghost, a pathetic remnant of a past he had successfully and ruthlessly discarded. He genuinely believed I was sitting there hoping for a few leftover scraps, perhaps a minor trust fund, or a quiet, insignificant financial settlement to help me fade quietly into obscurity. I held his gaze without blinking, my expression carefully blank, betraying absolutely nothing of the massive, destructive storm that was about to break directly over his head. Arthur Vance sat at the head of the table, impeccably dressed and terrifyingly calm. He meticulously adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, opened the thick leather-bound folder resting in front of him, and cleared his throat. The sharp sound cut cleanly through the heavy, expectant silence of the room. He began to read the preliminary legal jargon in a slow, monotonous drone, deliberately drawing out the agonizing anticipation. He formally confirmed Thomas's passing, established the legal validation of the document, and recited the standard, boring preliminary clauses required by state law. Then, Arthur finally reached the specific section they were desperately, hungrily waiting for. He paused, looking up briefly over the rim of his glasses to gauge the room before reading the critical paragraph. To my wife, Elena, I leave the entirety of my physical shares and controlling equity in Vanguard Horizon. Arthur read, his voice echoing slightly against the smooth glass walls, giving her full, undisputed legal ownership of the corporate entity, all of its active subsidiaries, and its operational headquarters. Elena gasped softly, a highly theatrical sound of mock surprise, and immediately reached over the table to squeeze Marcus's hand tightly. Marcus did not even try to hide his overwhelming triumph. He exhaled a long, heavy breath, his chest expanding visibly with the ultimate satisfaction of a predator that had finally, effortlessly secured its massive kill. He flashed a brilliant, victorious smile directly at my face. It was the unmistakable look of a man who firmly believed he had just inherited a technology empire worth billions of dollars. He thought he had completely won the game. He thought he had outsmarted my brilliant brother, successfully stolen his entire life's work, and discarded his loyal sister without suffering a single microscopic consequence. I did not react. I simply watched the red second hand on the large wall clock tick forward. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. However, Arthur Vance said, that single, simple word dropped into the quiet room like a massive stone plunging into a still, dark lake. The victorious, glowing smile on Marcus's face froze instantly, hardening rapidly into a mask of sudden, sharp confusion. Arthur slowly, deliberately turned the heavy parchment page of the will. The loud rustle of the thick paper was the absolute only sound in the suffocating room. He did not look up this time. He kept his eyes securely locked on the document, his voice dropping into a colder, much more clinical register. As per the executed and finalized restructuring agreements dated 7 months prior to my passing, it is hereby formally acknowledged that Vanguard Horizon has undergone a complete, internal corporate divestment. Arthur read, his words incredibly precise, slicing through the air like a surgical scalpel. The corporate entity currently known as Vanguard Horizon no longer holds any legal ownership of any proprietary technology, internal patents, algorithmic core structures, or active client databases. Elena's tight grip on Marcus's hand suddenly loosened. The healthy color began to drain rapidly from her perfectly painted, arrogant face. Marcus leaned forward aggressively, his elbows hitting the mahogany table with a heavy thud. His brow furrowed in deep, aggressive incomprehension. "What exactly are you saying, Arthur?" Marcus interrupted, his voice tight, the smooth, polished arrogance entirely gone, replaced by a jagged edge of rising panic. "What do you mean, it no longer holds ownership? It is a premier technology firm. The patents are the entire foundation of the company." Arthur calmly raised his hand, a silent, powerful signal demanding absolute silence. He did not answer Marcus's frantic question directly, but simply continued to read from the binding legal document. All intellectual property, including all 84 registered tech patents, the entire fundamental source code of the Vanguard engine, and all liquid cash reserves exceeding standard operating costs, were legally and permanently sold for a nominal sum of $1 to a private, anonymous holding company incorporated in the state of Delaware. Arthur stated firmly, this specific transaction was legally binding, fully finalized, and irrevocably sealed well before the time of my documented death. The silence in the room was now absolute and completely terrifying. It was the kind of heavy, crushing silence that immediately precedes a massive structural collapse. Marcus's jaw literally dropped slightly, his eyes darting frantically between Arthur's stoic face and the thick legal folder. The magnificent, glittering empire he thought he had just conquered was dissolving into thin air right in front of his very eyes. Arthur turned one final, devastating page. He looked directly at Marcus, his expression completely devoid of any human empathy or warmth. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, raising his voice slightly to ensure every single syllable struck its intended target with maximum force, "the sole proprietary owner, primary shareholder, and acting chief executive officer of this private holding company, which now legally possesses 100% of the wealth, assets, and technology previously housed within Vanguard Horizon, is named as Lydia Ward." I sat perfectly still in my chair. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the devastating, world-ending realization crash into Marcus like a runaway freight train. The air was violently sucked out of his lungs. He stared across the table at me, his eyes wide with a sickening mixture of absolute horror and profound, paralyzing shock. He realized in that exact, crystallizing fraction of a second that I had known everything all along. He finally realized that while he was busy playing a cheap, pathetic game of marital betrayal, my brother and I had been quietly orchestrating his total, inescapable annihilation. But Arthur was not finished. He still had to deliver the final, fatal blow with the cold mechanical precision of an executioner pulling the lever on the gallows. Consequently, the corporate entity that Elena has just legally inherited today, the physical shell of Vanguard Horizon, contains 0 technological assets, 0 liquid capital, and 0 revenue-generating contracts. Arthur concluded, closing the heavy leather folder with a loud, definitive snap. What the entity does retain, however, is the entirety of a severe, deliberately structured tax liability through a series of aggressive, highly leveraged financial maneuvers executed immediately prior to the asset transfer. The empty shell company, now known as Vanguard Horizon, currently carries a federal tax debt and defaulted offshore loan obligations totaling precisely $45 million. As the new 100% owner of the entity, Elena, and by legal marital association, Marcus, you are now personally and entirely responsible for this immediate, catastrophic corporate debt. The very next morning, precisely at 8 o'clock, the sleek glass doors of the Vanguard Horizon headquarters were violently pushed open. It was not the usual influx of bright-eyed software engineers and eager marketing executives. Instead, a highly coordinated swarm of federal agents and forensic accountants from the Internal Revenue Service flooded the massive lobby. They moved with terrifying mechanical efficiency, dressed in sharp, dark windbreakers and carrying heavy stacks of empty cardboard boxes. Within 15 minutes, they had completely secured the building. They slapped bright yellow seizure tape across the heavy glass doors of the executive suites and immediately ordered the terrified information technology department to lock down every single server and physically disconnect the entire internal network. Marcus had arrived at 9 o'clock, strutting out of his private elevator with a forced look of authority, ready to play the role of the embattled but resilient chief executive. That pathetic illusion shattered the instant a stern federal agent pressed a federal search warrant directly against his chest. They demanded a comprehensive, retroactive audit of every single ledger, expense report, and offshore wire transfer executed over the past 36 months. Marcus tried to shout, tried to order them out of his building, but his voice cracked, echoing weakly down the cold, rapidly emptying hallways. The panic truly set in precisely 2 hours later. Desperate to hire a team of elite defense attorneys to stop the bleeding, Marcus and Elena rushed to the marble counters of their exclusive private bank in downtown Seattle. Elena arrogantly slammed her platinum credit card down, demanding an immediate cash withdrawal of $50,000. The teller swiped the card, frowned deeply, and swiped it again. The machine beeped a harsh, flat note of denial. Marcus shoved her aside in a panic, pulling out his own black card linked to his primary wealth management account. Denied. The impeccably dressed bank manager eventually stepped out from a back office, his face entirely devoid of his usual fawning warmth and customer service smile. He coldly informed them that absolutely every single one of their personal and joint accounts, including their hidden offshore emergency funds, had been completely frozen under a sweeping federal mandate. The transnational financial investigation into their massive embezzlement scheme had officially triggered total asset freezes across all banking institutions. They had literally zero access to cash. They could not buy a plane ticket. They could not hire a lawyer. They could not even purchase a cup of coffee. The millions they thought they had cleverly stolen were locked tightly inside a federal vault, completely out of their reach. While they stood frozen in the lobby of the bank, the corporate apocalypse was simultaneously unfolding back at the office. The phones in the Vanguard Horizon executive suite began ringing incessantly, a chorus of absolute doom, one by one. Every single major strategic partner, every massive cloud hosting provider, and every key international client formally terminated their existing contracts. The legal clauses Thomas had brilliantly inserted allowed for immediate termination in the event of severe financial insolvency or federal criminal investigation. The mass exodus was swift and utterly brutal. Within a mere 6 hours, 95% of the company's active revenue stream evaporated into thin air. But those massive tech giants did not just cancel their contracts. They immediately signed new, highly lucrative, ironclad development agreements with my newly formed, fully capitalized holding company. I sat in the quiet comfort of Arthur Vance's office, quietly sipping hot tea, serenely watching the massive influx of multi-million-dollar contracts routing directly into my secure servers. Vanguard Horizon was rapidly turning into a decaying, hollow skeleton, stripped of every ounce of its former glory. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the local media had caught the heavy scent of blood in the water, the explosive truth about their vile affair, the grotesque embezzlement scheme, and Marcus's desperate, failed plot to steal my brother's empire leaked directly to the biggest business news outlets in the Pacific Northwest. The digital headlines were absolutely ruthless. They painted Marcus not as a visionary tech leader, but as a pathetic, greedy opportunist who had tried to rob a dying man and got spectacularly crushed by his own monumental stupidity. The high society elite of Seattle, the very people who had happily drank vintage champagne with them just days prior, instantly and violently severed all ties. Marcus was aggressively blacklisted from every private country club, every elite executive board, and every wealthy social circle in the entire state. He became financially and socially toxic overnight, a walking cautionary tale of corporate greed and spectacular failure. The suffocating pressure finally caused their toxic alliance to brutally implode that evening. I received the vivid details later from the terrified household staff who witnessed the spectacular meltdown inside my brother's lakeside estate. The exact moment they realized the true, inescapable horror of the $45 million federal debt resting squarely on their shoulders. Elena viciously turned on Marcus. The delicate, weeping widow routine vanished completely. Replaced by a screaming, venomous rage, she hurled priceless crystal vases across the massive living room, shattering them violently against the stone fireplace. She cursed his name, screaming that he was an incompetent, useless failure who had promised her a global empire but delivered only a massive, inescapable prison sentence. She brutally mocked his lack of foresight, laughing manically at how easily my brother had played him for a complete fool. Marcus tried to scream back, tried to violently assert his dominance, but he was entirely broken. The fragile house of cards they had built on lies and stolen money was collapsing directly onto their heads. Elena, true to her fundamentally parasitic nature, recognized that the sinking ship was completely unsalvageable. Late that same afternoon, while Marcus was locked in the master's study frantically trying to call lawyers who flatly refused to answer his calls, she executed her final, cowardly betrayal. She systematically emptied the hidden wall safes in the master bedroom. She frantically stuffed her massive, imported designer travel bags with every single piece of expensive jewelry, every diamond necklace, and every loose stack of emergency foreign currency she could find. She did not leave a note. She did not say goodbye. She simply ordered a private car service under a fake name, slipped out the back service entrance of the massive estate, and vanished into the stormy evening. She cowardly abandoned Marcus to face the absolute certainty of federal prison time and decades of crushing financial ruin completely alone. The grand, unstoppable power couple had been utterly decimated in less than 12 hours. Exactly 2 months passed since the day the federal agents raided the glass tower and completely dismantled the illusion of his grand empire. The swift, brutal wheels of the federal justice system were systematically grinding Marcus down to fine dust. It was late on a Tuesday evening, perhaps a little past 9 o'clock, when the heavy, relentless Seattle rain returned, violently lashing against the large front windows of my quiet suburban home. I was sitting in the comforting warmth of my softly lit living room, quietly reviewing the final quarterly projections for my new, highly profitable holding company, when the aggressive, frantic pounding on my heavy oak front door completely shattered the peaceful silence. I did not rush. I carefully set my electronic tablet down on the coffee table, smoothed out the fabric of my trousers, walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor, and flipped on the harsh amber porch light before unlatching the heavy wooden door. The wretched creature standing on my welcome mat barely resembled the impeccably dressed, wildly arrogant man who had proudly handed me divorce papers just a few weeks prior. Marcus was completely soaked to the bone. His tailored designer suit jacket was long gone, replaced by a cheap, wrinkled, terribly fitted trench coat that clung pitifully to his violently shivering frame. His hair, usually styled with absolute precision, was plastered in wet, chaotic strands across his pale, sunken forehead. Deep, dark purple bags hung heavily beneath his bloodshot, terrified eyes, and the sheer, unfiltered terror radiating from his entire trembling body was almost palpable. He looked completely feral, hunted, and entirely broken by the crushing weight of his monumental failure. The absolute instant the heavy door swung open, his weak knees violently buckled beneath him. He collapsed forward onto the hard, wet concrete of the porch, scraping his bare hands as he practically crawled toward the tips of my leather shoes. "Lydia, please," he sobbed, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze that barely cut through the loud, ambient roar of the pouring rain. "You have to help me. You are the absolute only one left. Everyone is gone. My elite defense lawyers formally dropped me yesterday afternoon because I cannot pay their massive retainer fees. The federal prosecutors are officially filing criminal fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion charges against me on Thursday morning. They are talking about 20 to 30 years in a maximum security federal facility. Lydia, decades. I will not survive it. You know I will not survive a place like that for even one single year." I stood perfectly still. Looking down at him from the elevated threshold of the doorway, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no burning surge of righteous anger, no lingering spark of past affection, and definitely not a single, microscopic drop of human pity. My heart beat at a completely normal, steady rhythm. He was no longer my husband, no longer a threat, no longer anything of consequence. He was simply a pathetic stranger crying on my front porch in the middle of a storm. He reached out with a trembling, freezing wet hand, trying to desperately grab the hem of my warm cashmere sweater, but I took one slow, deliberate step backward, keeping my physical space completely out of his frantic reach. "It was all her idea," Marcus wailed, thick, ugly tears mixing freely with the cold rainwater streaming down his hollowed cheeks. "Elena entirely manipulated me. She used her looks. She used my immense grief over losing Thomas. She completely poisoned my mind against you. I was confused. I was utterly blinded by the massive stress of the corporate restructuring. She made me do those terrible things with the offshore accounts, but I never stopped loving you. Lydia, I swear to God above, I never stopped. We built a beautiful life together for 7 long years. You have the money now. You control the parent company and the massive cash flow. You have the absolute leverage to quietly pay off the federal tax debt and make the civil lawsuits vanish entirely. You could talk to Arthur Vance. You could save me from this nightmare. Please, I am begging you on my knees. Just give me one more chance to prove I can be the good, loyal husband you always deserved." The sheer, unadulterated cowardice of his desperate plea hung heavily in the freezing air, vastly more pathetic than the heavy rain soaking into his ruined clothes. He was eagerly willing to throw the very woman he had cruelly abandoned me for directly under the speeding bus simply to save his own pathetic skin. It was the ultimate, disgusting display of a man who stood for absolutely nothing but his own selfish survival. I looked deeply into his panicked, desperate eyes, and I finally spoke. My voice was incredibly calm, totally flat, and completely devoid of any emotional warmth whatsoever. It was the absolute, unyielding voice of a judge delivering a permanent, inescapable sentence. "You should not look so surprised. Marcus," I said, my precise words cutting cleanly through the noisy, chaotic storm. "You have always been far too weak, far too soft to truly understand ambition. You completely lack the spine to stand beside a woman who is destined to build and rule an empire. You would only drag me down with your pathetic sentimentality and your constant need for emotional validation." His wet, violently shivering jaw dropped slightly as he instantly recognized the exact venomous words he had so proudly spat at me in my kitchen on the very night of my brother's funeral. The devastating realization that I had absorbed every single cruel insult, and was now serving them back to him in his absolute darkest hour, seemed to physically strike him like a heavy blow to the chest.
Elena understands raw power, I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy, unforgiving whisper. She understands exactly what it takes to seize control. She is a woman of your exact caliber. You consciously chose your queen, Marcus. Now you get to burn in the spectacular, blazing hell you both built together. You are just collateral damage in a much larger, much more important game.
"No, please, Lydia!" he screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched shriek as he violently scrambled forward, desperately pressing his wet hands flat against the wooden doorframe to stop me from closing it. "You cannot do this! You cannot just leave me out here to die like a dog!" "I am not leaving you to die," I replied coldly, staring right through his pathetic existence. "I am simply leaving you, without another single word." I grabbed the heavy brass handle and forcefully swung the thick oak door shut right into his face. The heavy latch clicked perfectly into place with a loud, absolute finality, immediately severing his agonizing, desperate screams from the quiet, secure warmth of my home. I engaged the heavy steel deadbolt, calmly turned off the amber porch light, and walked away, leaving him completely consumed by the cold, dark, and unforgiving reality of the Seattle night. Exactly 12 months had passed since the violent storm of betrayal had completely washed away the fragile remnants of my previous life. The newly formed holding company, now officially operating under a powerful new brand, had not merely survived the chaotic, transitional phase, it had aggressively and phenomenally expanded. We were no longer operating as a quiet, hidden entity operating in the dark. We had officially become the dominant, undisputed powerhouse in the logistics technology sector across the entire west coast of the United States. The brilliant, foundational core systems my brother had originally designed were finally deployed to their absolute maximum operational potential. We were actively managing immense global supply chains with an unprecedented, flawless efficiency that left our closest corporate competitors scrambling desperately to keep up. But true, lasting power is never simply about accumulating massive amounts of liquid wealth or securing corporate dominance. It is about building a profound, meaningful legacy that outlives you. Using the immense, record-breaking profits from our very first quarter, I proudly established a massive, fully funded educational foundation entirely in my brother's honor. The Thomas Ward Memorial Scholarship Fund was meticulously designed specifically to provide full university tuition, comfortable housing stipends, and guaranteed, high-paying job placements for brilliant, driven students emerging from situations of extreme financial hardship. Every single time I picked up my pen and signed a formal grant approval, I felt a profound, healing sense of peace washing over me, knowing exactly that his incredible genius was directly nurturing and empowering the next generation of young innovators. The final, lingering, toxic threads of the past were cleanly and permanently severed on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting comfortably behind my executive desk when the local evening news broadcast flashed across the large digital monitor mounted on my office wall. The bold, scrolling headline announced the definitive, pathetic end of a wretched saga. Marcus had officially been found legally guilty by a unanimous jury on all federal charges of massive wire fraud, grand corporate embezzlement, and severe tax evasion. The presiding federal judge showed absolutely zero mercy during the sentencing phase, permanently condemning him to serve a staggering 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. The camera briefly showed him being aggressively led out of the crowded courtroom in heavy steel handcuffs, his face completely pale, his shoulders heavily slumped in utter, inescapable defeat. The arrogant, greedy man who had once foolishly tried to conquer the tech world was now entirely erased from society, locked securely away in a tiny, barren concrete cell for the rest of his natural, miserable life. And Elena, the self-proclaimed, entitled queen who had so cowardly abandoned her failing king at the very first sign of danger, did not fare much better in the end. Her desperate, secret flight across the country ended in spectacular, humiliating fashion. When a relentless nationwide federal warrant finally caught up with her, she was physically apprehended by federal marshals in a cheap, rundown, dirty motel room in a distant southern state, desperately attempting to illegally pawn a stolen diamond necklace for quick cash. She was currently sitting alone in a cold, concrete holding cell, entirely stripped of her expensive designer clothes and her false manufactured elegance, anxiously waiting to be formally extradited back to Washington state to face her own severe, inescapable criminal trial. The grand, towering illusion they had murdered my brother's trust to build had completely and utterly turned to worthless ash. I did not throw a party to celebrate their absolute destruction. I simply took a deep, cleansing breath, turned off the television monitor, and drove quietly away from the bustling city center. The expansive sky over the sprawling cemetery was brilliantly blue and entirely cloudless, presenting a stark, incredibly beautiful contrast to the freezing, gray downpour of the agonizing day we had laid him to rest exactly 1 year ago. The warm afternoon sun gently illuminated my face as I walked slowly up the familiar, manicured green hill. I stood quietly and peacefully before his polished marble headstone and gently laid down a massive, beautiful bouquet of pure, blooming white lilies. I stayed there for a very long time, simply talking to him in the quiet, gentle breeze. I proudly told him all about the booming corporate empire, the incredible success of the Scholarship Foundation, and the thousands of young lives his enduring legacy was now actively changing for the better. Standing there bathed in the warm sunlight, I finally understood the profound, undeniable wisdom hidden deeply within his final masterful plan. The absolute sharpest, most devastating revenge is never found in screaming matches, physical violence, or engaging in petty emotional retaliation. The ultimate, most satisfying revenge is utilizing the profound, agonizing pain inflicted upon you by others as the absolute, combustible fuel to forge an undeniable, towering, and blinding success. It is entirely about proving your own hidden, boundless strength to yourself, while simultaneously rendering your enemies completely and utterly irrelevant to your bright future. To any person listening to this story who has ever been broken, betrayed, or heartlessly discarded by those you trusted the absolute most, hear my words clearly today. Do not ever let their unforgivable cruelty destroy your inner spirit. The miserable, spectacular failure of the liars and the cheats in your life is not the sad end of your story. It is the absolute perfect, fiery launchpad for your own magnificent, unstoppable rebirth. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. Please let me know in the comments exactly where you are listening from. If you found today's story engaging and powerful, please kindly consider supporting the Violet Revenge Stories channel with a simple donation of just $1. Your generous kindness directly helps pay the dedicated staff members so they can properly support their families and continue bringing you more incredible, high-quality stories exactly like this one. You can easily and securely donate by scanning the PayPal QR code directly on your screen or by clicking the convenient PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and always stay strong.